students, members of the community, faculty and staff in the audience. That's exactly what we want for our signature seminar sneak previews. I'm Linda Kuhn, I'm Dean of the Honors College, and this is our second in a series of 3 sneak previews. Last week, Professor Mark Killenbeck at School of Law discussed Supreme Court cases related to church and state. That was pretty amazing. This week, as you will hear, Professor Natarajan is going to talk about violence. I know, and then I have to go next week, which seemed kind of unfair. Talking about Gothic architecture with my colleague Kim Sexton in the Fay Jones School of Architecture. So these, for students in the room, as you know or you don't know, these are classes that you have to apply for. The applications are out on the Honors College website. You have to write a couple of essays designed by yours truly. And the reason for that is not to keep people out, but to get a nice mix of students. So engineers with Fulbright, with bumpers, et cetera, et cetera. And I see even Fay Jones School of Architecture was here tonight. Awesome. So, the application deadline is 11:59 p.m. on November 1st. That's very precise. It's the Honors College. So join us again next week. Apply for the classes. We're thrilled that you're here. This will also be on Facebook Live. Thank you so much for your friends that couldn't make it. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce, I have very good taste in faculty, I always say. That sounds self-serving, it is. But it's true. From the Department of Anthropology, Professor Natarajan, who will be giving both the lecture tonight, but teaching an amazing seminar in the spring, which will count for all kinds of credit, including upper-level anthropology, Fulbright social science, humanities colloquium, also international studies credit. So there's lots of ways you can get credit for this class. But Professor Natarajan comes to us with a PhD from New York University, where he worked on human rights, political violence, colonialism, all kinds of really exceptional and exceptionally disturbing topics. He's had every prestigious fellowship you can have in the business, from a Fulbright Hayes to a Social Science Research Council to an NSF, yes, see? Not just scientists get National Science Foundation grants. He just came back from a year at Cambridge, where he was a visiting fellow at Wolfson College. And he's finished a book manuscript called Violence Unresolved, which is about his specialty on Buenos Aires, Argentina, afterlives of violence, state violence, a truly exceptional book manuscript that is forthcoming. So, in the course, you will learn about political violence, violence against animals, violence against the climate. You see, this is a huge, wide-ranging story that doesn't just always involve human actors. So that's why I think this is going to be so brilliant. Well, please join me in welcoming the fantastic Professor Natarajan.
Thank you, Dean Kuhn, for that lovely, generous introduction, and to you and Dean Shields, and my chair, Dr. Joanne O'Sara, for the opportunity to teach this class in the Honors College, and thank you all for being here today. I wanted to start by reading a poem, or an excerpt from a poem, from one of my favorite books of the last few years, Citizen by Claudia Rankine, which is worth reading if you have not had a chance to read it. So Rankine writes, "A friend writes of the numbing effect of humming, and it returns you to your own sigh. It's no longer audible, you've grown into it. Some call it aging, an internalized liquid smoke blurring ordinary ache. Just this morning, another, what did he say? Come on, get back in the car. Your partner wants to face off with a mouth and who knows what handheld objects the other vehicle carries. Trayvon Martin's name sounds from the car radio a dozen times each half hour. You pull your love back into the seat because though no one seems to be chasing you, the justice system has other plans. Yes, and this is how you are a citizen. Come on, let it go, move on. Despite the air conditioning, you pull the button back and the window slides down into its door sleeve. A breeze touches your cheek, as something should. The phrase here that kind of seems key to me is, again, yes, and this is how you are a citizen. Come on, let it go, move on. Confronted as we are with so many different acts of violence worldwide, I could ask you all, what did you read in the news today? What have you been thinking about? And I'm sure there'd be many different examples. We have this question, come on, let it go, move on. What are the different ways in which, with shootings, with genocides that exist, with the different kind of refugee situations that exist, the different acts of violence are forgotten? And people say, come on, let it go, move on. But then that also raises the question, for whom is violence actually not something that they can let go and move on? And what does it mean then to live with and give care to those people for whom violence may be something irresolvable? This is the subject of my work, which takes place, as Dean Kuhn mentioned, in Argentina. Between 1976 to 1983 in Argentina, although it debatably started a few years before, there was a military dictatorship in the country. When we talk about dictatorship, it involves the kind of passing of laws that allow armed forces or another group of people to come into power and detain people on suspicion that they may be subversive. Now, who was defined as subversive was something that could range from anything from wearing trousers if you were a woman to having a beard if you were a man. This was in the context in which, in the kind of era of the 1970s, in which different organizations that were allied with the left were trying to take power in different countries throughout Latin America, and not just in Argentina, in other countries as well. Different militaries came to power, and they then started detaining and torturing and killing individuals who were suspected of being subversives. Argentina's violence involves people who were disappeared. This is a list from the newspaper of names. It involved over 400 different detention centers throughout the country. It involved capturing women who were pregnant and then holding them captive until they gave birth, and then killing the women and giving the children to be raised by different families. I want to read an excerpt from a testimony that I collected in the course of my research, which gets at this question of what exactly is the experience of violence like. This is from a man, a physicist, who was captured. He was captured because of his political affiliations, and because he was a physicist, he was useful to his captors. He said, "Daily life in the camp is the worst torture. I couldn't think about any fantasy because if I did, I would distract myself from taking care of myself." This man had a theory for why he survived, though, why he didn't become one of the people featured on this list. He said, "I'm a physicist, and as a physicist, I have knowledge on electronics. And when they realized this, they utilized me to repair all the electronics they had robbed during sequestrations. Televisions, music equipment, recorders, electronic gadgets. In this way, they needed me. Anytime there was a group of people who were going to be sent off to die, and in Argentina, one of the ways that people were killed in mass was by drugging them and then throwing their bodies out of airplanes to drown alive in the sea. So he said that anytime there were these different mass movements of people, not known at the time that they were going to be killed necessarily, he would be repairing different objects. And one day, one of the men asked him to repair a torture device. In Argentina, one of the main methods for torturing individuals who were accused of having the wrong politics was by electrocuting them with the equivalent of what is a cattle prod. It was invented by a man whose own daughter ended up being one of the victims of the device. So he said, when he told the man, "I can't repair an instrument of torture." When I said that, I had a knot in my throat. The man who had asked him to said, "Okay, we'll take care of that." After that, they began to torture with what was called a varivolt. And with the varivolt, people ended up in comas because of the charge was higher. And so he then decided that he told the men, "Bring me the device so I can repair it." They wouldn't continue torture with the other one because it was killing people and putting them in comas. So he repaired it, and he changed the voltage so it would be a smaller current, so it would still give people some amount of voltage, but not enough that they would be tortured in the same way that they would be in a coma. For me, this quote is very illustrative of just the kind of issue of what is at stake in the study of violence, understanding that violence can mean more than physical harm, but also extend to these kind of decisions where you have to decide, if you are put in this situation, what do you do? Do you end up repairing a device so that people are not going to be in comas? Do you say no when your own survival is potentially at stake? What do you do? This story of Argentina is not just a story of Argentina, as all of the different military dictatorships in Latin America are not. France was involved in training, or the French, different members of the French government were involved, the armed forces were involved in training different soldiers in Argentina and the United States. This is kind of archival material from my research in which Henry Kissinger was informed about what was happening in Argentina, and then he says, because I do want to encourage them. And so there was knowledge internationally of what was happening in the country, and with this knowledge, different politicians in other countries said, go ahead and let them be encouraged. I was doing research at a time in which Argentina had just passed through 20 years of amnesty laws. So amnesty laws are different protections put in place that say that different individuals who may be involved in detaining someone, in physically abusing them, they will not be subject to prosecution at any moment. In 2004, a president, Nestor Kirchner, came to power. And one of the things that he decided to do was that he was going to support different politicians and different human rights activists who wanted to put members of the military and the different people held as civilian collaborators on trial. The different individuals who survived their sequestrations, the people who lost kin, they had formed human rights organizations in Argentina, and they had campaigned nationally and internationally for over 20, 30 years to get trials to take place in the country. And so after years and years of what seemed at different moments struggle, a president came in power who said that he was going to hear them and accept their request that these violations not remain with impunity. In this era, it was not an era in which all forms of violence in Argentina remained unresolved. This was for many years the back of the 100 peso note in the country. It shows the destruction of indigenous people. Argentina is a country with streams of migration from Europe in the 19th century, and in 1876 an event took place known as the Conquista del Desierto, in which Julio Roca, a general, was involved in killing groups of indigenous people so that migration from from very specific countries in Europe could commence. So for many years in Argentina, this kind of scene of destruction of indigenous people was what was featured on the back of the 100 peso note. This whole issue of indigenous violence in Argentina at the time that I was doing research was not something that was attended to, and it was not something that necessarily had the same kind of visibility or audibility of the violences of the dictatorship. I started my work out with the question of what is it to be someone who has committed this violence. That was the central question when I started my work. It's changed a bit for the book. As part of my work, with amnesty laws rescinded, there were now over 3,000 soldiers and civilians standing trial in Argentina. So I would go to different courtrooms and then interview the judges who were hearing the cases. I would listen to the witness testimonies of people who had survived their detentions or lost kin, and then some of the military men who decided to testify and explain their own story, as it were, at least to then give their own justification for why what the military did was right. This is a picture of a man who was just convicted to genocide, and members of the police forces surrounded him and pointed their fingers in his face because they too thought that he should be blamed. My research one kind of last point before I move on. I was, not to use a bad pun, I jumped the gun there, but I wanted to read just kind of one more testimony from from work that also gets to why I call the book Violence Unresolved. So my work deals with law, it deals with men who either told me they had committed violence, some of whom were standing trial, others who were not, and then with people who had survived the different torture that took place to them. So this is from another man's testimony. So he was a doctor, and he did work with people who were less well off, who lived in slums, and because he was a doctor doing work with people who were less well off, that was something else that could be seen as bad politics or something that was subversive. So he says, from the moment they took me out of the car to the beginning of the first electric shock sessions, it took less time than I am taking to tell it. For days they applied electric shocks to my gums, nipples, genitals, abdomen, and ears. Unintentionally, I managed to annoy them because I don't know why, although the shocks made me scream, jerk, and shudder, they could not make me pass out. They then began to beat me systematically and rhythmically with wooden sticks on my back, the backs of my thighs, my calves, and the soles of my feet. At first the pain was dreadful, then it became unbearable. Eventually I lost all feeling in the part of my body being beaten. The agonizing pain returned a short while after they finished hitting me. It was still made worse when they tore off my shirt, which had stuck to the wounds, in order to take me off for a fresh electric shock session. This continued for several days, alternating the two tortures. Sometimes they did both at the same time. It was only several days later that, by moving the blindfold slightly, I could see that they had done to me. Before that, it had been impossible, not because I didn't try to remove the blindfold, but because my eyesight had been so poor. It was for the first time that I saw the state of my testicles. I remember that as a medical student, I saw in the famous textbook a photograph of a man who, because of the enormous size of his testicles, wheeled them around in a wheelbarrow. Mine were similar dimensions and were colored a deep black and blue. Another day they took me out of my cell and, despite my swollen testicles, placed me face down again. They tied me and raped me slowly and deliberately by introducing a metal object into my anus. They then passed an electric current through the object. I cannot describe how everything inside me felt, as though it were on fire. In the course of my work, I had read this testimony in the Truth Commission report that was published in Argentina. In the course of my work, I met this man I was familiar with his name, and I asked him, are you the man whose testimony I read, which was the testimony that impacted me the most in the Truth Commission report, and it was him. He, like other men in Argentina, because of the kind of torture and abuse that happened to him, is not able to have children. This is kind of one of the consequences of violence in Argentina, and part of why it remains unresolved, the way that it exists in the body, in which the body then loses kind of capacities for reproduction after the kind of genital torture that took place. Women also stopped menstruating after sessions of torture. This whole kind of idea of family that was so important to the kind of control of the dictatorship with capturing women who were pregnant. The kind of violence against the body became another way of controlling people as well and their kind of capacity to reproduce. And so I think about violence as not just this kind of moment of abuse, but the idea that violence is also the infliction of pain from and beyond that moment of injury as it goes out into the world in ways that social institutions oftentimes are unable to mitigate or ameliorate or comprehend or make sense of. The idea that violence is not just this kind of moment, but it also has this afterlife. And these kind of questions that I began reading kind of Claudia Rankine's poem, Citizen, come on, let it go, move on. These are questions that are very much ones that Argentines are themselves thinking of, because for many of them, after you deal with violence like this, there is in some ways no kind of possibility for reconciliation. Violence is always going to be irresolvable in the sense that the people who committed these actions should be punished. The people who committed these actions think that they were justified, which leads to situations as well in which people, actors, whether they've committed violence or they've suffered violence, try to kind of keep the country a place of violence being unresolved. The class, as getting into what the class is going to be about, it springs from this idea that's central to my work, that violence is what springs out from this moment of injury out into the world in ways that social institutions oftentimes cannot mitigate. I do want us just to kind of be aware as I talk about Argentina, and I'm sure as many of you are aware of, that these issues are certainly ones that we are dealing with here in the United States, in our own communities, with signs that we see like this, that diversity is a code word for white genocide. And also aware that our university borders part of the Trail of Tears on land that was Osage, with quotes from President Roosevelt like this when he said that though only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the Temp. Or further down south in the state, the internment camp Rower, where Japanese American citizens were held during World War II. And what remains is this empty field, and would remain that way, innocuous, unless a group of people who had spent time in the camp came together and put these different placards in place showing where the barracks were. With a picture then too that my colleague Kelly Hammond, who's teaching one of the signature seminars, showed me of Japanese American children in one of the camps in Arkansas, Jerome. And we see in the central image here the young student in blackface and the kind of recapitulation of different forms of violence with minstrelsy and the kind of degradation of blackface with the practice of internment. One of the reasons I teach this class is because oftentimes in dealing with situations of violence, it seems daunting, it seems shocking. I think when people are shocked by violence, on one hand, the fact that people have a capacity for empathy is a good thing, and it means we still have hope. On the other hand, we have to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean then to be shocked? What would it be like for the person who's experienced this? As I'm the shock, what is it like for them? But also that how is my own existence in some way, my own citizenship, implicated somehow in the kind of forms of violence being studied just by being a fellow citizen in a country, or through different acts of deliberate forgetting in which people are made not to even be aware of different events that have taken place. Hannah Arendt, whose work is tremendously influential, has a quote that I think is worth reading, where she says, "Isolation may be the beginning of terror. It certainly is its most fertile ground. In isolation, man remains in contact with the world as the human artifice. Only when the most elementary form of human creativity, which is the capacity to add something of one's own to the world, is destroyed, isolation becomes unbearable." In teaching this class, I suppose in doing work on violence as well, part of my effort or hope is that it gives people vocabulary to talk about these different situations that may seem ineffable and thus may seem like there's no kind of capacity to even talk about them, and that everyone has to exist in a kind of state of isolation. That's not the case. There are many different faculty members on this campus who do work on violence. I see Dr. Ted Swedenberg, who's worked on Israel-Palestine. In my department, Dr. Joanne Delacero's work is on the Sierra Leonean diasporas and the aftermath of war. There are different faculty members as well, Dr. Luis Fernando Restrepo, Dr. Erica Almenara, Dr. Hammond, whose own work is on World War II. And there are artists who have done paintings that deal with violence that you've kind of seen throughout, different poets like Claudia Rankine. These are all efforts, and in some ways in teaching this class, I get to share with the students all the different kind of ways and language that people have created to try to kind of face these moments of isolation and say that no, you are not alone. The other reason that I teach this class is I'm going to read from The Tempest by Shakespeare. This is Prospero's last soliloquy. This is, I guess, the closest I'll get to being an actor, in which Prospero says at the end, and I guess if you haven't read it, this is the ending. Now all my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have's my own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true I must be confined here by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver, dwell in this fair island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. I sometimes think part of my job as a teacher and with the work that I did is to make people more aware of the Prosperos in the world, those who feel like they, as those who have deceived, those who have enchanted, those who have put spells on consciousness, on the ways that people think, and are suddenly asking for indulgence, is to kind of raise the question, what is at stake for them in asking for that indulgence, and in asking that question, as for you from your crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. What is actually happening for those who have suffered violence, some of which is often not named as a crime? So that we have then some sense that there may be a kind of another life outside of these people who want to be pardoned from what they have done. Violence. When you think of this word, what do you think about? What are the kind of first ideas that come to mind?
War.
War, good. What else?
Pain.
Pain, good. One or two
Aggression.
more. Well, what did someone say?
Aggression.
Aggression, sure.
Power.
Power, good. These are some of the words I thought of, many of which you said are on there. I didn't put power, but that is absolutely right. Cruelty, force, injury, damage, suffering, destruction, pain, threat. Violence exists with another kind of body of concepts. And where we start in the class is actually to look at the origins of this term violence itself in the work of Raymond Williams. So in Raymond Williams' keyword on violence, he talks about how violence in the 13th century, or 14th century, it comes from the Latin word for force, but it oftentimes referred to violence against specific groups of people, such as priests, so that it was only kind of specific groups of people whose injuries against them were named as violence. If we turn to the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer and the tale of the wife of Bath, which is about a knight who commits rape, this is how rape is described. And so it so befell that this King Arthur had in his court a lusty young knight. One day this knight came riding from the river and espied a maiden walking before him, alone as she was born. And from that maiden anon, against her will, by very force, he took her maiden head. For which oppression there was such clamor and such demand for justice unto King Arthur, that this knight was condemned to be dead by a course of law, and he should have lost his head. What is significant here for me is that rape is described as force, it is not described as violence. And in this kind of category of violence, the term itself is a construct. It is haunted by a selectivity, which is something that we will study in the class, in which certain groups of people historically are held up as people who have experienced violence, and certain group of people are not. Talking about rape in the 19th century as well in the United States, Saidiya Hartman has researched this. Women who were enslaved, if rape was committed against them, that was not considered to be a violation, that was not considered to be violence, because as slaves they were subject to not law, but they were subject to the laws that slaves were subject to. And so this whole idea of what counts as violence is something that is itself bound up in the different kind of institutions and the different people who institute different forms of injury, as well as different kind of bodies such as law that then can create crimes or else define what counts as illegal and what counts as legal behavior. From Raymond Williams and the kind of definitions of violence, we turn to the question of how is violence committed? To think about this issue, we look at the work of Nancy Shepherd Hughes, an anthropologist who did work on Brazil with mothers who are economically poor, who do not feed different children of theirs. They selectively feed children who were born money, and the local authorities as well as the local religious authorities kind of sustain this practice either through different rituals for the children after they've died or through kind of facilitating the death certification process. We look at Emiko Onuki Tierney's work on the Japanese soldiers who flew the pilots in what at least in the United States is called the kamikaze operations. She studies the way in which different soldiers had symbolism that was used to kind of believe that what they were doing was something tied to nation and national sacrifice. We also look at Michael Taustig's work on colonialism and the issue of storytelling and how, at least in kind of cases of Colombia and the rubber cane plantations, storytelling was involved in how people who were administrating the rubber cane plantations came to see through stories indigenous people as fearsome and savages, and thus people who should be injured or killed to deal with the kind of threat of their savagery. This idea of looking at the social ways that violence is committed is in some ways meant to engage the kind of literature on whether or not violence is biological. We read Robert Sapolsky's work as an example of the kind of literature that's out there on whether violence is biological or not. The literature shows that different kind of parts of the body may be involved in the way that violence gets realized, whether through the limbic system or the amygdala. That those kind of theories in explaining that there might be a kind of, as one anthropologist, Vina Das, has put it, an absorption between the social and the natural, that they kind of work together. Biology still does not explain why violence takes place. From looking at how violence is socially realized, we turn to two different cases to challenge the kind of ideas of violence that exist. We first look at the whole discussions around climate change and Rob Nixon's work on climate change as violence, also reading from Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. So one of the whole ideas of slow violence is that violence is happening around us gradually in ways that are oftentimes not the kind of scenes of blood and injury or fatality that may be associated with it, but instead deal with the kind of the gas emissions and the raising of temperatures. And this whole idea of looking at the climate and looking at land as something that can be violated is meant for us to question then the definition of violence as itself, as not just people who can experience it, but also something that's land as well, which in many different societies is also seen as something that's social and not something that is inert. From the issue of climate, we then turn to animal violence, and we read Arluk and Sanders' work on animals. We watched a documentary called The Cove, which is about the killing of dolphins in Japan, and we read a short story by Carradwin Dovey called I, the Elephant Wrote This, about an elephant's experience of war. Arluk and Sanders' work has shown that different animals in different societies have different values, meaning that sometimes animals are seen to be good or seen to be kind of more anthropomorphized, and other animals are seen to have less of a kind of social importance, like rats. The issue then is that these kind of animal features can then translate into different people in the way that on the basis of race or gender, different people can also be described through animal language, which then facilitates at different moments, or has facilitated at different moments, their own injuries against them. We then turn to the issue of nonviolence, and we read from Christopher Browning and his work on soldiers in the Nazi Third Reich who refused to, or were reluctant to take part in massacres and would either hide or in some cases request doing other services as well, which then led in much of the scholarship it's argued to kind of practices like the gas chambers. These are the gas chambers at Auschwitz where people who were Jewish were then involved in killing their own brethren, but that the kind of guilt then would be displaced from an official onto someone else. We look at Frantz Fanon's work as well, and his theories that nonviolence is actually not a possibility in a society, especially in colonial contexts. And then we read from Martin Luther King and Gandhi on their own theories of what nonviolence is. Throughout this class, we will question what this idea of nonviolence is and whether it actually does exist. In many societies, they define not only what counts as violence, but also what violence counts as acceptable, what violence does not count as acceptable. And for people who have experienced violence as well, there is a question then whether nonviolence is in fact a germane or felicitous term to describe what they have experienced. Which takes us to the second part of the course, which is on afterlives and what are the consequences of injuries. So very important for us will be the work of Elaine Scarry and The Body in Pain, and the idea that what happens to the body when it's injured is that the body is in fact in pain, in a kind of physical pain through which the body then oftentimes cannot feel comfort again, and it has to reestablish trust in the world. We'll also read from Veena Das's work, who's been very influential for me, and I want to go over her ideas of what violence is and how it affects people, because it is kind of critical, I think, for our own collective understanding. So influenced by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, she says, "Let us take Wittgenstein's statement that the subject does not belong to the world, rather it is the limit of the world. Without going into a sustained defense of my interpretation at this point, I suggest that in thinking of the subject as constituting the limit of the world, Wittgenstein is proposing that the experience of being a subject is the experience of a limit. The world is not invented by me, as the cliche goes, but then how do I make the world mine?" What I read Veena Das to be saying is that the experience of a subject is the experience of a limit. What does this mean? As people, we have different limits on us. We have the limits of the body and what the body is capable of. And then as people as well, in any kind of society, there are the limits defined for any person by virtue of what identity that they have, whether it be father, whether it be a mother, brother, sister, different issues of gender as well. So what violence does then is that it not only affects the body, but it also affects people's senses of themselves, these different limits that they have for their place in the world. And when violence affects those limits, the question then is, how exactly do people live in the world? If your sense of self is shattered, what do you do then? So Veena Das did work in India in the aftermath of partition with women who had suffered abductions or sexual violence. And she found that the way in which women were able to remake their everyday lives, if they could, because it's not always possible, it was a continuous effort day after day of what she calls descending into the ordinary, of continuously having to remake life and continuously having to work to establish trust in place. This will take us into the issue of trauma and what we make of theories of trauma, which trauma is very much a real experience, but as a name and as a diagnostic, it's very much a technology of commensuration. It's kind of a name that, or a theory that exists to kind of try to approximate someone's experience with this different kind of category or name that has been created. So we will read the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who is a trauma specialist, as well as Didier Fasson, who is an anthropologist, who writes on the kind of construction of the category of trauma. This is an image from World War I and the medical archives in Britain. These are soldiers who were injured after World War I. During World War I, shell shock was the diagnosis given to soldiers. It was not trauma. So we will trace the way in which shell shock then develops into a different diagnostic. From there, we will get to the issue of how people who've committed violence live with what they have done. We will watch a documentary, The Act of Killing, by Joshua Oppenheimer. I might share a chapter of mine if I'm feeling daring. And we will read from the work of Zoe Wool, who's an anthropologist who did work with soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan who were injured. And she's very much interested in the possibilities of everyday life for soldiers who've been in Iraq and Afghanistan, when in fact the kind of official political discourses out there said that what they were doing was a sacrifice or doing something that was heroic. And then they come back and they are rehabilitating and they have to kind of recreate life for ways for themselves that oftentimes differs quite greatly from the discourses and the terms that they set out for them and how to live. This will then take us to the issue of memory and what counts as memory in the aftermath of violence. Memory and forgetting can be linked because to remember some things, it's been argued that oftentimes forgetting takes place as well. So we will do an activity in the class where I will ask the students to design, maybe memorial is not the right word, though it is, but memorial may not be the right word because the violence in Iraq and Afghanistan are ongoing. But if they were to design a memorial for the Iraq and Afghanistan violences, what would that look like? How would it be similar to, let's say, the Vietnam Memorial? Would it be different? Which will then take us to the issue of justice and prisons and the question of what counts as justice. This is a picture by Egon Schiele, the great artist, from his own brief imprisonment. So we will read Michel Foucault's work on the shift of punishment, in which in the 13th century and 14th and 15th, punishment was public spectacle, with people being injured in public as a way for the sovereign to make a point that if you do something bad, this is what's going to happen to you. But as people became more sympathetic, and as ideas of property changed as well, a different idea of the person came about, so that punishment shifted to the soul, and the soul was what was going to be published, not just the body. Along with Foucault's work, we'll read the work of Lorna Rhodes, who does ethnographies on maximum high security prisons in the United States. That will take us then to the last subject of the class, is there an end to violence? And we will look at nuclear weapons and drone technology, and Elaine Scarry's work on nuclear weapons and the 16,400 nuclear weapons that exist. And my own take on this issue is that when we do live in a world with these different kind of weaponry in place, just with the kind of potential of them, this kind of question, is there an end to violence, is not one that there is an easy answer to. So that's the class. As someone who I see myself as a bit of a pacifist, for me the class is a useful exercise in thinking about what is a kind of continual struggle for me of what I think about violence and what forms of violence I am aware that people hold as acceptable and whether I hold them acceptable or not as well. For instance, World War II, what do I think of that? What do I think of the decision to use military force in a situation of such extreme gravity and severity? With students who take the class, when I've taught different versions in the past, I've had students who've gone on to do tremendous things. One student made a documentary about a dancer and how if words are not necessarily a means for conveying pain, perhaps the body could be, with the different dance movements. There was a student who became interested in the Holocaust and did an honors project on memory and memorials after the Holocaust. I had a student who started a letter campaign to the governor about labor violence in Arkansas and different factories where people have to wear diapers on the job because they don't have time to take breaks, and so they have to wear diapers. The students who've taken this class have found ways to make it meaningful to themselves with everything that is happening in the world, in our nation, from gun shootings to migrant detentions, to then what we read about Rohingya genocides in Syria. Even if you're not taking this class, I hope that it's provided you some kind of vocabulary to think through these different issues that we live with and read about in the news. And so I'll just end with the kind of anticipation for the students who may take this class of what we will learn together next semester. Thank you.
Entertaining questions? All right, open it up for questions.
Yes.
I don't remember if you specified why the specific countries for your research, like why specifically Argentina and the others.
The question of why Argentina changed in the course of my research, I had studied Latin American studies as an undergraduate, and I studied abroad in Argentina when I was 20 for a summer for about a month and a half. And I was very struck by the difference between a kind of post-colonial British context, my family is from India, and the kind of post-colonial context of a post-colonial Spanish country, though that there were similarities between the two. And so I originally had a project that I was going to do on cemeteries in Argentina, and then I learned that there was a community of people who had migrated from India to Argentina, and so I was doing work with them, and one of the families had a son who was a soldier in the armed forces. So I went with the family to a military base and then met people who had been active during the era of the military government who spoke to me about their commission and services. And so how my research started out was really with this question of what was it like to be someone who had committed violence in this particular country. And I guess that was the question of why Argentina, was that at the time, and Argentina was one of the few countries, not globally, but at least in Latin America, that was taking the initiatives that it was to confront legacies of human rights violations. In Argentina, there are different terms that people who condemn the military have created, like represor and genocidio, that kind of try to say that people who committed these actions should be held accountable and what they did is not acceptable. And so the question for me was always then, what is it like then to kind of transition from one identity to another, from kind of service where laws were passed by a government for illegal actions, to then a context in which they now have different names. In the course of my work, though, as I met more people and learned about their lives and their struggles, I did work with mothers who had been made to listen to their children being tortured in rooms next to them, or men who were accused of crimes who had started hunger strikes to protest. There was a sense for me that the kind of details of how they lived with violence were very specific to them, and so their stories came to me matter more. So I guess that's the question of why Argentina. Yeah.
Will we look at in the class, for the students that take it, how different cultures approach violence and how they live with that aftermath and the different approaches that they take?
Absolutely, we will do that. And I think that that was one of the points that I was trying to make, is that trauma is one of the ways that cultures do it. Trauma is not a universal category, nor is PTSD. PTSD was created as a diagnostic after the Vietnam War for very specific reasons, dealing with the kind of stigma that existed for soldiers, oftentimes for the first times in a war where victory was not as clear as it had been in other wars. So one of the things to remember is even a kind of diagnostic like trauma is something that is cultural. It does not mean that people do not experience trauma in other places. It just means that having this kind of category is a cultural way of dealing with the issue. Yes?
So in circumstances when you have people who are perpetrating the violence, whether it's Argentinian soldiers or other situations, do they technically count as victims of violence? Maybe not on a personal level, but just the general society that's created this circumstance?
That's a very important question, and it's one that's subject to much debate. In the course of my work, there were some prosecutors who said that they did think that eventually soldiers would be able or should be able to sue or have their commanders who gave them orders to say that they were victims. Of course, this is much debated because it gets into issues of agency and intentionality, and whether when you kind of are intentionally torturing someone in the ways that I described, whether it's just that you're following orders when you're doing that. One of the things with people who committed violence, and we will read about this, is that oftentimes violence has to ground itself in a discourse, meaning that if a state exercises monopoly over violence, when we're talking about state violence, it oftentimes have different justifications or different narratives that go along with it for why use of violence has to take place. And historically then, oftentimes one of the ways that states have legitimized that use is precisely through the issue of turning themselves into victims, to say that we are in danger and we are at risk, and because of that, we have to exercise the use of force. So we will look at that. Maybe I can turn this into a classroom now, since we're all here together. When you hear this topic of violence, coming into this lecture, what were the kind of issues that you were thinking about? And as you read about what's happening in the news right now, what are your kind of thoughts or kind of ways that you understand this, or you wish then that oftentimes different issues of violence would be covered? Yes?
For environmental violence, who is responsible for taking on the role of trying to fix it and make amends? Is it the country that it originates from, or is it the world's responsibility, or is it on the individual, the corporations? Who is it? Whose responsibility is it?
We have a person who works on climate change who I'm looking at, who I could call on right now.
You could.
I could. Do you have thoughts on that, Dr. Bynum?
Sorry?
Do you have thoughts on that question, Dr. Bynum?
I have very complicated thoughts on that.
Well, let's hear them.
While you're talking, I'm thinking in my head that if I'm going to see climate change and environmental change as a violent issue, it then really makes me need to redefine violence, and I'm hoping not to just kind of retreating back into the need to define the question issue. But I think it really does go to this idea of, is violence about intentionality? Is it about inflicting harm? Is it about defining in-groups and out-groups, people who are perpetrators or victims of violence? And I think that really complicates how we would look at climate change or environmental change as a violence issue, potentially. If we define it as that, then the countries, and by extension the individuals in those countries that enjoy the standards of living that contribute to climate change, would then bear a lot of responsibility for addressing it. But again, I hope this is a discussion that comes up in your class, because it really, I think, comes back to how you want to construe violence and how that then would change how we see something like climate change in light of that.
Yeah,
It puts it in a dramatically different light.
absolutely. And this is a question that is happening as we speak now in Congress with the testimony of Greta today. So it was a very good question. Thank you. Yeah.
So this summer I spent a lot of time studying genocide and found out there are a lot of people with very strong opinions and specific definitions of what they will qualify as
Right.
genocides and things.
Right.
How important or not important do you think is it to qualify these different types of violence into certain groups?
That's actually a subject that we look at. I just realized I completely skipped a whole unit that we're going to cover, which is what is it to give violence a name. And we will look at the issue of terror, and we will look at the issue of genocide in relation to that. So genocide as a category covers issues like race and religion. It does not cover sexuality. So for instance, people who are killed on the basis of their sexuality, that is not covered under the definitions of genocide. So it does get to the important heart of whether or not this category is all inclusive. What are your thoughts on that question?
I just know because there's so many different, I haven't studied with all types of violence, mainly just with genocide. And the fact that there's so many different opinions from different scholars, and you have like the UN definition. Some believe it's important because they don't want to, start claiming that everything is a genocide, but you don't also want to leave it so specific that you're not calling things genocides that truly would be.
Right, of course. And I think tied to that is another question of even if this name exists, what actually then exists on the ground to stop the violence from happening, and then for the people who have been affected, what exists for them as well. Because that's kind of one of the issues with the human rights policies, that different laws can be passed or different laws stipulating things like genocide that exist, but they then have to be put into practice.
Right.
And that oftentimes is a challenge.
Thank you.
Yes?
When we're talking about getting justice for people who have experienced violence, especially in the past, one of the ongoing issues that I was interested in was justice for the comfort women in South Korea, who are demanding the Japanese government, in fact in Japan, to admit to these crimes. And it was always really interesting of how like the Japanese don't seem to, it's probably tied back to like political and historical, why they don't want to seem to admit it, but like just that refusal of acknowledgement, and like by acknowledging what it actually means, the violence, what it means for a country to acknowledge that they have done this. This is a country against a country, and not people against some people.
Absolutely, that gets into kind of issues too of transnationalism, which is one of the, I think, and this gets to your question of when you asked about Argentina, is that when we are talking about specific places, they are also connected to the rest of the world. So to talk about the South Korean women also deals with Japan, to talk about Argentina means we have to talk about its ties to other places as well, which is a very important point to bring up then. What happens then when you take this issue of demanding justice, but it becomes an international issue. And then dealing with sexual violence as well, which is an issue that, as we are reading about daily, is one that remains difficult for many different legislatures to address. Yes?
I'm curious about your thoughts on the depiction of violence on stage, on screen, in popular culture. As a dramatist, the Greeks kept the violence off stage in the Greek tragedy. This plucks his eyes off stage. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the sort of progression of that to today, and how popular culture sort of fits into your class.
That's a good question. After doing my work, for a while, I could not engage with pop culture or its kind of depictions of violence. It was not only too much for me, but it also seemed just sort of very, in some ways, curious that after kind of seeing what people had gone through to kind of then see experiences fictionalized and violence fictionalized. I guess I have two different thoughts about this, at least two different thoughts that immediately come to mind. The first is that art, of course, can explore whatever it wants to. I think that in different shows that exist, when we talk about violence, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that there are different forms of violence. Injuries are injuries, pain is pain, but there are different processes through which they come about. So if there's a show like The Wire, for instance, that deals with violence against African Americans, that's kind of a very specific form of violence that has to be historically contextualized to understand how it comes into being, as opposed to, let's say, a show like Game of Thrones and a dragon burning a throne. And so I think that's one thought that comes to mind, is that when speaking about the arts and violence, it's just a kind of question of how then maybe even as a playwright you would take that account. I mean, I know in your own work too, you've addressed the issue of migration and how you kind of think then of the kind of historical processes through which things like tensions happen. and how you kind of create a story around that. The other thing that also comes to mind, and I was asked about this a few weeks ago, is that I grew up as part of the Harry Potter generation. I wonder if the students are also still part of the Harry Potter generation. And so it was, I think that I was, as a kid, I read Beloved and I read Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson about the Japanese internment camp, so I was aware of different kind of historical events of violence that had been taking place that had been turned into stories. With Harry Potter, of course, and Voldemort, there are people who are disappeared, and that of course happens in real life, like in cases like in Argentina. And I guess that's the other thing that I think about with the arts, is that there are certain shows where it almost seems like violence is gratuitous, and it's almost used as the hook, because it's almost like this thing that could never happen to other people. It's only kind of the people on the screen. And then there are other works that do explore what things like injury do. And it's also kind of clear in those works somehow that what is described as fiction is also a fact. I don't know how artists achieve that, but I guess that's part of what makes them art. Yes?
You mentioned that in class we'll be kind of discussing, there'll be kind of like discussions about, is there an end to violence?
Yes.
I'm curious to see, also what kind of, maybe curious kind of like, what is violence, what's the beginning of violence? Is it like the people are born inherently violent? Is that part of human nature? Or is that kind of nurtured into us by the world we kind of live in and stuff like that?
That's the question that's at the heart of the first unit of how violence is socially realized. And so that's kind of looking at the different debates on the kind of the biological research that exists. It does show that there are different kind of bodily neural pathways or chemicals that may be involved when different people commit violence, but that's a different kind of explanation than saying that violence is biological. I guess to say that there is kind of a very specific part of the body that gets activated when someone commits violence, than saying that that part of the body is the reason, or that gene is the reason that violence takes place. In terms of when there is a start to violence, there's work done by biological anthropologists that says that the kind of first recorded instances of violence are at least 2500 to 1500 BC. So that's kind of the first kind of skeletal sign that exists for when skeletal remains are shown to have impact. But we will touch on that a bit.
All right, well, y'all have been an amazing audience. We really appreciate you coming out. Let's give Professor Natarajan a great round of applause.